There's a rule almost no one wants to admit is real, but everyone has felt it. Whoever cares less has control. Not because they're cruel, not because they're manipulative, but because emotional investment always shifts power. And the moment one person leans in more than the other, the balance changes. This is how most relationship imbalances begin. Not with betrayal, not with dishonesty, but with unequal care. There was a couple that looked stable from the outside. They talked daily, spent time together, shared plans. But slowly something shifted. He started caring more. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. He adjusted his schedule. He checked his phone more often. He thought about how his words would land. She didn't change much. She still showed up, still responded, still cared, just not as much. And that difference created a silent hierarchy. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Control in relationships doesn't come from dominance. It comes from detachment. The person who needs less reassurance feels safer. The person who can walk away feels stronger. The person who has more emotional independence sets the tone. This isn't strategy, it's psychology. When two people care equally, the dynamic feels balanced. But when one person begins to care more, they begin to adjust their behavior. They explain more, they accommodate more, they hesitate more. Not because they're weak, but because their nervous system is seeking stability. And stability starts to feel external instead of internal. This is where people misunderstand the idea completely. They think caring less means being cold. It doesn't. It means being less attached to outcome. The man in this story didn't lose control because he loved her. He lost control because his emotional center moved outside himself. He started measuring his state by her responses. Was she slower to text? Was she quieter today? Did something change? Once your emotional baseline depends on someone else's behavior, power has already shifted. The Stoics warned about this long ago. They believe that anything you cannot lose without disturbance has power over you. And relationships are no exception. When you need someone's affection to feel grounded, you've handed them leverage. Not intentionally, not consciously, but structurally. The woman didn't wake up wanting control. She didn't plan to dominate the dynamic, but she felt it. She felt that he was more affected by her moods than she was by his. She felt that silence bothered him more than it bothered her. And the nervous system reads that difference instantly. This is why attraction often fades before people understand why. Because attraction is tied to perceived emotional stability. The person who cares less appears more stable, even if they aren't. The person who cares more appears less grounded, even if they are. That perception shapes behavior. He started checking in more. She started pulling back slightly, not as punishment, as response. Because humans naturally adjust to the emotional weight in a connection. When one person carries more, the other carries less. That's the emotional power game. And it's almost always unconscious. This is where the hook becomes uncomfortable. Whoever cares less has control, not because they want it, but because they don't need to negotiate their inner state. They don't rush to restore balance. They don't chase reassurance. They don't fear silence. And silence is where power reveals itself. The man started filling silence, explaining, clarifying, reassuring. The woman started observing, not judging, just noticing. And observation creates distance. Distance creates hierarchy. Hierarchy kills intimacy, not immediately, gradually. This is why people confuse love with control. They say, I cared more, so I lost. That's not true. Caring isn't the problem. Dependency is. The moment care turns into emotional reliance, attraction starts to bend. The Stoic lesson here is brutal but simple. You can care deeply without making someone else the regulator of your emotional state. You can love without surrendering self-command. But most people don't realize when they cross that line. It happens slowly. You stop doing things that might disrupt harmony. You start prioritizing emotional safety over self-expression. You start choosing peace over authenticity. And the other person feels it. They feel the shift before you do. Because power dynamics aren't logical. They're physiological. The nervous system senses who is anchored and who is adjusting. The anchored one leads. The adjusting one follows. This doesn't mean the anchored one is right. It means they're less reactive. And reactivity always places you lower in the hierarchy. This is why emotionally independent people feel powerful. Not because they don't care, but because they can care without losing themselves. The man in this story wasn't weak. He was emotionally exposed without emotional containment. And exposure without containment always creates imbalance. This episode isn't about teaching you to care less. It's about teaching you to care without collapsing. Because the moment your peace depends on someone else's consistency, you've already given away control. And that's where the story really begins. Perfect. Most people don't realize the exact moment control shifts. It doesn't happen during arguments. It doesn't happen after betrayal. It doesn't even happen when love fades. It happens when emotional dependency replaces emotional presence. At first, the man didn't notice anything wrong. He thought caring more meant loving better. He believed showing up harder would strengthen the bond. So he leaned in. He became more available, more responsive, more emotionally expressive. And none of it was fake. It was sincere. But sincerity doesn't protect you from imbalance. It can actually accelerate it. Because when one person starts investing more emotional energy than the other, the dynamic tilts. Not because the other person becomes manipulative, but because emotional gravity shifts. She started feeling less pressure to hold the connection together. Not because she didn't care, but because she felt his effort carrying the weight. And when one person carries more, the other naturally carries less. This isn't cruelty, it's psychology. In every system, the side applying more force compensates for the side applying less. Relationships are no different. The more he tried to stabilize things, the more she relaxed into letting him. Not intentionally, not consciously, just naturally. This is how control slowly transfers. Not through dominance, through emotional imbalance. At some point, he noticed changes. Her text became shorter, her replies slower, her energy quieter. Nothing dramatic, just different. And that difference triggered his anxiety. So he compensated. He explained more, he reassured more. He tried to restore the emotional closeness he felt slipping. But reassurance doesn't restore balance. It exposes fear. And fear shifts power faster than silence ever could. The Stoics warn that the moment your emotional stability depends on someone else, you lose sovereignty. You don't lose dignity. You lose leverage. Not strategic leverage, psychological leverage. Because whoever is least afraid of loss holds the upper ground. Not because they are indifferent, but because they're anchored. This is the emotional power game. Not a game people choose, a game they enter unconsciously. The woman didn't start caring less intentionally. She simply felt less internal urgency. And urgency is what fuels emotional intensity. When urgency disappears, emotional energy flattens. Not into apathy, into comfort. But comfort without polarity becomes boredom. And boredom is lethal to attraction. The man started sensing this. So he increased effort. More communication, more clarity, more emotional presence. But intensity doesn't repair imbalance. It amplifies it. Because the more one person reaches, the more the other pulls back. Not to hurt, to breathe. This is the paradox of closeness. When someone leans too far in, space disappears. And without space, desire suffocates. The woman felt this tightening, not as pressure, as emotional crowding. So she instinctively created distance. not through coldness, through detachment. And detachment feels like control. The man felt the shift immediately, but instead of pulling back, he leaned forward. This is where most relationships collapse, not in conflict, in pursuit. When one person begins chasing emotional equilibrium, they surrender their position, because the one who chases is always lower in the hierarchy than the one being chased. This is brutal, but true. The Stoic principle is clear. You must be able to hold uncertainty without demanding resolution. If you cannot, you become reactive. And reactivity is submission. The man's emotions were sincere, but sincerity without containment becomes emotional exposure. And exposure without grounding invites imbalance. This doesn't mean suppressing feelings. It means not bleeding them. The difference is subtle, but everything changes there. He didn't need to care less. He needed to need less. Neediness isn't weakness. It's dependence. And dependence places your emotional safety outside your control. That's where power leaves. The woman didn't feel superior. She felt steadier. And steadiness always reads as strength. This is why emotionally unavailable people feel powerful. Not because they don't care, but because they're less affected. Their emotional baseline doesn't fluctuate with external behavior. So others adjust to them. The man adjusted to her moods. She didn't adjust to his. That asymmetry created hierarchy. Hierarchy killed intimacy, not instantly, gradually. The man felt confused because he was doing more and receiving less. This contradiction breaks people. They think effort should produce closeness, but effort without polarity produces distance. This is why the phrase feels so uncomfortable. Whoever cares less has control, because control doesn't come from effort. It comes from emotional independence. The woman didn't wake up deciding to withdraw. She simply didn't feel the same emotional pull. Because emotional pull depends on tension, and tension depends on uncertainty. Once everything is explained, clarified, and emotionally laid bare, there's nothing left to wonder about, nothing left to pursue, nothing left to lean into. This is the moment attraction quietly dies. Not because love disappears, but because emotional gravity vanishes. The man had become predictable. Not boring, predictable. And predictability removes emotional charge. The Stoics believe passion thrives on uncertainty. Not chaos, but open-endedness. When someone becomes too emotionally available, they collapse the unknown. And with it, desire. This episode isn't telling you to withdraw love. It's telling you to preserve your center, to care, without making your emotional stability dependent on reciprocation. Because the moment you start caring more than you can regulate, you enter the power game. And once you're in it, the only way to regain balance is to reclaim yourself. Not by pulling away, but by recentering. Which is where this story finally turns. Reclaiming control doesn't start with pulling away. It starts with coming back to yourself. Most people make the mistake of thinking the solution to imbalance is distance. It isn't. Distance without grounding is just another reaction. Real control returns when your emotional center stops orbiting someone else. The man in this story eventually realized something uncomfortable. He wasn't losing her because he cared. He was losing himself because he needed her responses to feel okay. That realization didn't come through logic. It came through exhaustion. He was tired of monitoring tone, tired of reading between lines, tired of adjusting himself to maintain connection. And that fatigue was the signal. Whenever a relationship starts to feel like emotional labor, power has already shifted. Not because one person is wrong, but because one person is overinvested. This is the moment most people either collapse further or wake up. He chose to pause, not to punish, not to manipulate, not to test her, but to observe his own behavior. He noticed how often he checked his phone, how quickly his mood changed based on her replies, how much of his inner peace depended on her consistency. That awareness changed everything, because awareness interrupts patterns. The Stoics believed that freedom begins the moment you stop being ruled by unconscious impulses. And his impulse was simple. He wanted certainty. He wanted reassurance that things were still okay. But certainty demanded explanation. And explanation was draining the connection. So he stopped explaining. Not abruptly, not dramatically, quietly. He didn't withdraw affection. He withdrew urgency. He didn't become distant. He became steady. This is the part people misunderstand. Regaining control doesn't mean caring less. It means regulating more. He still cared, but he no longer chased emotional equilibrium. If silence happened, he let it exist. If tension appeared, he didn't rush to fix it. If uncertainty arose, he stayed grounded. And something unexpected happened. The dynamic shifted. Not instantly, subtly. The woman noticed the change. Not because he said anything different, but because he felt different. His energy was no longer reaching for reassurance. It was settled. And settled energy changes how people respond. She felt less pressure to pull away. Not because he was trying harder, but because he wasn't leaning in emotionally. This is the paradox of power. The moment you stop trying to regain control, control returns. Not as dominance, as balance. The emotional hierarchy flattened, because he was no longer adjusting to her moods. He was anchored. And anchoring creates polarity. Polarity revives attraction, not the explosive kind, the grounded kind. The Stoics taught that attachment to outcome is the root of suffering. In relationships, attachment to outcome is also the root of imbalance. When you need someone to respond a certain way for you to feel stable, you give them power. When you allow responses to be what they are, you keep your sovereignty. This doesn't mean indifference. It means resilience. The woman didn't suddenly chase. She didn't dramatically change, but she leaned in again, because the emotional weight was no longer one-sided. He wasn't carrying the connection alone. He wasn't bleeding reassurance. He wasn't explaining his worth. And that allowed respect to return. Respect doesn't come from intensity. It comes from self-command. This is why emotionally unavailable people often feel powerful. Not because they don't care, but because they don't overextend emotionally. They don't collapse into the connection. They remain whole inside it. The man learned this the hard way. Control wasn't something to be taken back. It was something to stop giving away. Every time he chased reassurance, he gave it away. Every time he over-explained, he gave it away. Every time he sacrificed his inner stability to maintain harmony, he gave it away. When he stopped doing those things, power returned naturally. Not because she changed, but because he did. This is the truth most people resist. You don't regain control by changing the other person. You regain it by stabilizing yourself. The moment your peace no longer depends on someone else's behavior, the emotional power game ends. Not with victory, with balance. This is why the phrase still makes people uncomfortable. Whoever cares less has control. But the deeper truth is this: whoever needs less has control, needs less reassurance, needs less validation, needs less certainty. Because need creates pressure, and pressure creates imbalance. Caring deeply is not the problem. Losing yourself in that care is. The Stoic path is not about emotional withdrawal. It's about emotional containment. You feel fully. You act deliberately. You don't surrender your inner state to external fluctuations. When you do that, relationships stop feeling like games. They become choices. The man didn't stop loving. He stopped negotiating his worth. And that changed everything. This episode isn't telling you to become colder. It's asking you to become steadier. Because steadiness is what creates respect. And respect is what sustains attraction. Not effort, not reassurance, not emotional performance. but self-command. That's the emotional power game. And once you see it, you can never unsee it.